Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. This story was shared by you/nicead1355. Wendigo in my area? Skinwalker/Wendigo in my area. I'm not really sure how to structure this post. My anxiety is rising as it's beginning to grow darker. But, here goes it. Before I start writing, I'd like to preface that I've always been one to love the paranormal, ghosts, demons, etc., but cryptids are not my forte. I wouldn't consider myself a hunter though. I don't go poking the bear. I just like to dabble in research just in case something stumbles upon me, which I fear has happened. Thursday, August 17th at around 2:30 in the morning I believe, I woke up to this loud screeching sound. It was sharp and short. It came in intervals of 4, and then would stop for about 30 seconds, and then kick up again. It did this about 3 times, before it started to die down. Fortunately, I was able to record 2 of the single sounds, which I will attempt to post after this so you guys can hear it. Immediately I sent my friend, he will remain anonymous, the audio. He's really big on this kind of stuff, and he said that the sounds were coming from a Wendigo. Obviously I'm here almost pissing myself, cause the screeching woke me up. And I've never had anything like this wake me up before. I've been living in the mountains since 2019. So I've heard my fair share of animal noises. And this wasn't like anything I've ever heard before. The said friend just told me to make sure my windows are locked and keep an eye on my pets, which never leave the house anyways. I feel I should mention that I do have chickens, but they are more my stepmom's responsibility. Anyways, after that I ended up reading a little on the creature and then ended up going back to sleep. Because at this point it was 3 in the morning. Even being super into the supernatural, I have never experienced their presence. It's one thing to hear stories, but being at the telling end of that story is so different. So that's really all I have to say. I guess I just need some I-to-know connection. Maybe you guys can tell me about similar experiences so I don't feel so alone. And maybe you have some tips to keep myself safe. I'm not going out to poke the bear per se, so maybe if I just leave it alone it won't F with me. Second story. This story was shared by you/overall_disaster4224. Talking about the Wendigo. Howdy, me again from the Skinwalker post. This time we'll talk about the Wendigo. Wendigo is actually a spirit that lurks within the frost-covered mountains of the U.S., specifically Algonquin Territory and Great Lakes region. It is in constant search for people. These people usually fit 2 different demographics, either starving, desperate, poor and cold, or arrogant, selfish, greedy, and gutless. Once it has its victim, it'll possess them. Firstly, it will influence their actions, usually driving them to cannibalism. Then there's the transformation. It's important to note that the whole deer skull thing is a later addition from media and other influences that is not mentioned in mythology and legend, so if you've seen a deer skull Wendigo you're either lying or you've seen something different, which is more worrisome. Also important to note that the Wendigo, like the skinwalkers, are not cryptids. A cryptid is an unknown species. Wendigo is a spirit, and the physical Wendigo is basically a human even though they look like giant corpses. The individual will lose their hair quickly, they become painfully thin to the point where their bones jut out, in some cases their organs would spill, their skin loses whatever life and color it had and will become either a ash gray or a sallow yellowish pale. Its heart is of ice. It becomes so hungry it'll bite on its lips until nothing but sharpened yet rotting teeth and gums show. The eyes are sunken and it grows rapidly. Anywhere from 6 to 15 foot tall, it is also stated to grow in proportion to whatever meal it ate. They're quick on their feet and have strength comparable to that of a grizzly bear. They do have their weaknesses. Fire is most famous. After all, it's the most effective with frostbitten, giant cannibals, and is shown in the tale where a Wendigo kidnaps a boy. The Wendigo gets its legs hacked off and its head decapitated, and its corpse is burned, so it seems enough physical damage to its corporeal could kill them. But with their vast knowledge of the woods and mountainous regions, it'll more than likely be one step ahead, and with voice mimicry it'll lead you to getting lost. It's a perfect mix of savagery and cunning, the apex predator of the north if you will, and with its ability of voice mimicry it'll lead any unsuspecting traveler to a violent end. Third story. In the remote, desolate forests of northern Canada, where the biting cold and howling winds dominated the landscape, a small town named Frostwood stood as a testament to human resilience against nature's harsh elements. However, there was a darker force that lurked in the shadows, a malevolent entity that had haunted the region for centuries, the Wendigo. Legend had it that the Wendigo was once a man, a trapper named Nathaniel Blackwood, who became lost in the unforgiving wilderness during a brutal winter. Starving and desperate, Nathaniel resorted to cannibalism to survive. Consuming the flesh of his companions tainted his soul, and he transformed into a monstrous creature, cursed to roam the forest in search of more victims to satisfy his insatiable hunger. As the story goes, the Wendigo possessed an insidious ability to mimic the voices of its victims, luring unsuspecting prey deeper into the heart of the woods. The townsfolk of Frostwood grew up hearing cautionary tales about the creature, but many dismissed it as a mere folktale to scare children into behaving. One winter, a group of friends decided to embark on a camping trip near Frostwood. Eager for adventure, they set out with backpacks and camping gear, unaware of the lurking danger that awaited them in the icy wilderness. The group consisted of Alex, the level-headed leader, Emily, the adventurous thrill-seeker, Jake, the skeptical jokester, and Sarah, the nature enthusiast. Their journey began on a clear day, the sky painted with hues of blue and white. The crisp air hinted at the promise of a thrilling adventure. As the friends delved deeper into the forest, the temperature dropped, and an ominous silence settled in the air. Unbeknownst to them, the Wendigo watched from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly malevolence. Night fell, and the group set up their campsite, nestled between towering trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. Around the crackling campfire, the friends shared laughter and stories, temporarily forgetting the eerie tales of the Wendigo. Unbeknownst to them, the creature had already begun its deadly game. As the fire flickered, Jake suddenly heard a faint voice in the distance. "Help me," it whispered, mimicking the voice of his sister who had disappeared in these woods years ago. Intrigued and concerned, Jake convinced the group to follow the voice into the darkness, unaware that they were falling into the Wendigo's trap. The forest grew denser as they ventured deeper, the shadows swallowing them whole. The temperature plummeted, and an unnatural chill filled the air. Emily felt a sudden unease, but her adventurous spirit urged her forward. The voice continued to beckon, leading them to an ancient, abandoned cabin hidden deep within the woods. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with a foul stench, and an eerie silence replaced the once comforting sounds of the forest. The friends hesitated but pressed on, their flashlights revealing decaying furniture and tattered remnants of a forgotten time. As they explored, the voice became more desperate, echoing through the twisted corridors of the cabin. Suddenly, the friends found themselves trapped in a nightmarish maze of shifting walls and endless hallways. Panic set in as the voice taunted them, morphing into the anguished cries of lost loved ones. Shadows danced on the walls, and the temperature dropped to bone-chilling levels. One by one, the friends succumbed to the Wendigo's psychological torment. Sarah saw visions of her family being devoured by wolves, while Emily heard the agonizing screams of her childhood friends. Jake, paralyzed with fear, couldn't escape the haunting memories of his sister's disappearance. Alex, the leader, struggled to maintain his composure as the Wendigo toyed with his deepest fears. The Wendigo reveled in their terror, its monstrous form materializing in the shadows. Towering over the friends, its skeletal frame and glowing eyes struck fear into their hearts. The creature's elongated limbs reached out, its touch draining the warmth and life from their bodies. In the final moments, the friends huddled together, their breath visible in the icy air. The Wendigo circled them, a grotesque dance of death. With a bone-chilling growl, it lunged forward, consuming the friends in darkness. The forest fell silent once again, as if nature itself mourned the loss of those who had dared to defy its ancient curse. The legend of the Wendigo lived on, a cautionary tale whispered by the few who survived encounters with the malevolent creature. Frostwood remained a town haunted by the specter of Nathaniel Blackwood and the monstrous entity he had become, a reminder that some legends are born from the darkest depths of the human soul, and the wilderness holds secrets that are best left undisturbed. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/Sicarius Frost. There are things in the woods that will never be explained. It was almost 15 years ago now that I first met one of the most interesting people I know. True to that nature, I also met him in one of the most interesting and unexpected ways. I was out hiking on a trail in Washington State. It was a remote area, but one which I was fairly familiar with. On that particular day, I decided to venture far beyond the hiking trail I normally took to just for the sake of exploration. After some time, I entered a sunlit gully which led up to a local mountain, rife with blooming conifers and serene, glistening pines. I was alone that day, and felt my soul rejuvenate a bit with every breath of the fresh mountain air. After probably 20 minutes I was well off the beaten trail, and I found something worrying. I was about to take another step when I paused mid-stride, seeing a circular, jagged, metal ring laying just behind a small shrub. It was a good thing I didn't put my foot down, as the ring proved to be an improvised bear trap. "The hell you doing out here?" A gruff male voice suddenly shouted from somewhere unseen. I looked around, trying to find the person who had spoken, when he chose to step forward and reveal himself. An older man sporting a long gray beard then emerged from the brush. He had amber skin, long grayish-black dreadlocks, and a scar on his right cheek. He wore a raggedy brown coat that looked hand-woven, and old jeans patched in multiple spots by mismatched fabric. His eyes burned like campfires, and his hands clutched a bolt-action rifle while his lip cradled a sizable wad of chew. "I asked you a question, son. What are you doing here?" After fumbling on my words for a moment, I was finally able to piece together a response. "I was just out hiking, sorry. I didn't know anyone lived out here." The man seemed to silently inspect me for a moment. I felt my pulse soar in my chest, as I wondered what he intended on doing. We were, after all, completely alone out there. "You see that trap back there, son?" He pointed to the same trap I had narrowly avoided stepping on a minute earlier. I nodded and swallowed hard. He tilted to the side and spewed a mouthful of tobacco spit into the dirt. Guess that means I gotta hide him better. He stared at me completely deadpan, and I felt my heart plunge into the depths of my stomach. I thought he was some maniac hillbilly cannibal hellbent on having me for lunch then, but then he suddenly burst into a fit of raspy laughter. I was left there confused and partially horrified as the man continued to cackle for several seconds. "Oh, I'm just kidding, son." He wiped a tear from his eye and recomposed himself as I continued silently debating whether or not I should run like hell. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and smiled at me. "Apologies, buddy. My wife always said my sense of humor was a bit dark." I eyed the man over, and he suddenly seemed less sinister than he had a moment ago. There was a sense of jubilance in his gaze, like he was genuinely happy to see me. It's hard to explain, but it kept me from running. I forced a laugh myself. Good thing for both of us, I guess. This hiking has given me a major case of swamp ass. Can't imagine I taste too good. The man burst out into laughter once more, and this time I joined in. In that moment, I knew I had found a new friend. The man formally introduced himself not long after as Mark Hastings. After conversing for a while, he told me that he had lived in that particular area for a couple years at least, though admitted he didn't know exactly how long he'd been there. He said he left the city life behind in 96 foot, and seemed quite surprised when I told him the current year was 2020. Mark's accent was something which struck me as quite interesting, as it was one I couldn't quite pin down. He had a slight southern drawl and yet at times also sounded as though he may have had a bit of British influence as well. He pronounced words like again as again and had a strange vocal inflection. The best way I can really describe it as the way someone speaks in old black and white movies, proper and yet somehow country. We got to talking and he told me more about himself. He said he used to do construction back in the day, but when his wife got sick with cancer it really changed things for him. He said she battled it for almost 3 years, but eventually lost the fight. Afterwards he was left alone and with a mountain of medical bills to account for. Rather than pay them off and attempt to move forward, Mark chose a different path. It's funny, you know? You work your ass off for years, begin building the life you want with the woman of your dreams, and then it all just falls apart for no good reason. Then when you at your lowest, good old Uncle Sam comes in and slaps you with a bill you ain't never gonna pay back. So I say, to hell with them. To hell with their taxes and debt. Out here I am truly free. There ain't nothing left for me in the real world anyways. There was a distinct glimmer of pain behind his gray eyes as he said it, and I felt myself feeling sorry for him. He wasn't at all what I expected when we first met. Just a normal guy whose life fell apart through no fault of his own. In a way I found it sort of admirable. The system beat him down, and rather than just accept it and be a good little wage slave, he left it all behind with one big middle finger. I visited Mark pretty regularly after that, and tried to make the trek out to see him at least once a month. He always seemed to have a smile on his face when I came to visit. Soon enough he even invited me back to his cabin for a fresh meal and some drinks. I was a bit hesitant at first, but decided to accept. Part of me expected him to prepare a meal of squirrels and tree bark when he first offered, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Mark made us a fresh rabbit stew with some homegrown potatoes and bread he had made from scratch. On top of that he even had his own home-brewed ale to wash it all down. It was surprisingly delicious, and really made me admire Mark more for his resourcefulness. He wasn't just some half-assed camper, he was truly a man of the land. His cabin was reminiscent of one that would have been used by early 18th century trappers. A handcrafted stone chimney was his only source of heat, while animal pelts covered the walls and strips of meat were drying on his jerky rack. There were 2 couches in the main room constructed of whittled wood and bearing hand-woven pillows stuffed with feathers. He had no electronics of any kind, claiming he didn't need those technologic doohickeys anyways. Mark had 2 bloodhounds, Raleigh and Daisy, that lived there with him and were his only real companions. I eventually asked if he ever missed civilization or got lonely out there, but he immediately refuted the question. For a while, yeah, but not anymore. It's easy to forget about society when society already forgot about you. I really grew to admire Mark, and even cherish our friendship. Over our many meetings he would tell me stories about his life. Told me all about his business and his wife before she passed. The way he spoke about her in particular truly broke my heart. He was a man who met his soulmate and built a life he loved with her, only to have it all ripped away by the cruel hands of fate. More than anything though, Mark was always ready to tell me how much he hated the government. I think that was what made me like him the most. One night he and I were drinking some of his homebrewed honey ale and chilling around his campfire. He had just got done telling a story about a 5-point buck that he had narrowly missed a few weeks earlier. He finished with admitting that he heard some weird, loud noise from the woods that scared it off before he could fire. That detail got me thinking, and since I've always been a fan of the paranormal and whatnot, I figured I'd go ahead and ask him. You ever seen anything really creepy out here? Mark's eyes opened wide, and he immediately lowered the mug from his lips. He wiped the suds from his bushy beard, and stared down at the campfire for a couple seconds. I could tell he knew exactly what I meant. He then chuckled and rocked in his chair with a smug grin. Zach, I tell ya, you don't know creepy until you've spent some time out here. He then began to tell me a story of when he had first began living out there. He said it took him close to a year to finally assemble his cabin, at least partially. During that time, he and his dogs were living in a simple tent. Mark said that a couple weeks after living there, he started noticing something odd. Every once in a while, he'd awake to find mutilated animals just outside the perimeter of his camp. Usually it was just small creatures like rabbits, birds, and squirrels, but it didn't stay that way. Over time, Mark began finding more and more corpses left at his camp. He thought it was the work of a puma at first, despite the fact that the corpses seemed to retain most of the meat. He quickly rethought that though when he found an actual puma corpse one morning. He said most of the animals had slash marks along their sides and necks, and many had been disemboweled. He began thinking it was the work of some deranged person, but even that thought didn't last long. One night as he was preparing to turn in for the evening, he heard a rustling sound coming from within the forest. He ducked down underneath some timber, in hopes of catching a glimpse of the culprit. Both of his dogs were already chained up for the night, so he knew it couldn't be one of them. A figure then emerged deeper in the woods. Mark said he didn't see the entire thing, but he could tell it was bipedal and scrawny. I asked if it could have been a bear with mange, but Mark claimed it was way too skinny for that. He said he'd seen sick bears before, and they looked and moved nothing like that thing. Mark initially planned on trying to shoot it, but after seeing that, he admitted he didn't think that would have been a good idea. The creature dropped something on the perimeter, which Mark discovered the following morning was the corpse of a raccoon. The thing's head then tilted, and appeared to stare directly towards Mark. They just stared there in silence for several seconds, until the dogs began snarling voraciously from inside the tent. They must have caught its scent, and the thing suddenly crouched on all fours and dashed off back into the woods as the dogs went ballistic. Mark didn't know what he had seen that night, and apparently never saw it again. To me, it sounded like a Wendigo or skinwalker based on his description. I told him that, but he had no idea what those things were. He seemed to think the thing was actually leaving him gifts, but I wasn't so sure about that. I asked him about the typical creatures as seen in creepypasta and television lore. I mentioned the Wendigo, skinwalkers, Slender Man, the Rake, Siren Head, and some of the well-known others, but Mark didn't seem to know anything about any of them. He did, however, know about something he called the Whistler. Apparently, ever since he had been out there, he heard an odd whistling sound on occasion. It started off as little more than a dull, barely audible noise in the distance. He said at times it would come closer, and at others it seemed like it was further away. Mark thought it was a bird for the longest time, but one night he found the truth. He was chopping wood, when suddenly the whistling noise emerged. This time it was different, and this time it was closer than ever before. Suddenly there was a rustling noise from behind him. Mark spun back, but only saw a few branches bristling back and forth. He then heard the whistle again, louder than ever before. He looked up, and there it was. About 20 feet up in a large oak tree was some kind of figure. Mark described it as kind of human with a head that looked like some fucked up eel. He said he saw the thing stare down at him with beady black eyes. He just froze, and before he could do anything the thing suddenly leapt from the tree. It crashed into another one further away, and continued whistling and crashing as it blended into the depths of the woods. I didn't know what to say to that. I have heard legends about the whistlers out in the woods, but never heard about anyone having actually seen them. The way he described it sounded quite creative, and I wondered whether he was capable of an imagination so elaborate or if he had actually seen what he claimed. I asked him whether he thought this whistler was the same creature that was leaving him corpses, but he just shook his head. Without being prompted, he told me another tale about hearing voices in the woods sometimes. Sometimes it was that of an old man, sometimes that of a young girl, and sometimes it didn't sound human at all. I wondered whether my new friend was perhaps schizophrenic or suffering from some mental illness that caused him to hear these things. I obviously didn't tell him that, but his claims had to be met with some amount of skepticism. What do you think it was? Mark leaned back, and his head swiveled on his shoulders. No clue, son, and part of me hopes I never find out. He went on to explain that he'd continued hearing voices on occasion, but never saw who or what was making them. He seemed to think all the voices were coming from the same entity, though. Without being prompted, he took the conversation in an entirely new accusatory direction. It's the goddamn government, Zach, messin' with things they got no business messin' with. He then delved into a conspiratorial rant about how the government, and specifically the guys in black trucks, that were up to some really shady antics. He said they knew about the gates in the forest, and had been actively trying to open them. He didn't elaborate on what exactly he meant by that. You see them out here? You know, government, CIA? Mark looked confused. CIA? He asked. It was my turn to look confused then. Yeah, Central Intelligence Agency. You know, Men in Black, MK Ultra and whatnot. Mark still appeared slightly puzzled. I didn't understand how a guy like him who hated the government to such an extreme degree had apparently never heard of the mother of all conspiracy agencies like the CIA. He then seemed to have an epiphany and his eyes lit up in recognition. "Oh yeah. I forgot all about them." He then laughed and shook his head as he downed another swig of ale. "My memory ain't what it used to be, I'm afraid. Goddamn, how could I forget them?" "Well, in my defense, they don't carry no badges out here. And their vehicles don't exactly advertise who they work for." He paused and rubbed the back of his neck. "But you've seen them out here?" Mark met my eyes and nodded. "Oh yeah. Mark told me that one time he had been tracking elk through the woods in late autumn. He'd followed the trail for a few miles, when he suddenly heard a noise coming from a grove up ahead. It sounded nothing like a bear though, and more like several people arguing. Mark crept slowly forward, taking care to not disturb the foliage and remain out of sight. After a couple seconds he saw the outline of several people emerge in the grove. One man was on his knees in the center, while 4 men in black suits surrounded him. The man on his knees had open wounds and bruises upon his face, and his clothing was torn and tattered. He was begging the others for mercy, but they didn't appear to be the forgiving type. 2 of the men were speaking quietly to one another, while the other 2 stood watch over their apparent captive. The man on his knees was dressed in white, with Mark describing his clothes as looking like a surgeon's uniform, or maybe the attire of someone from an insane asylum. He listened but couldn't make out what the 2 other men were talking about, but they were clearly arguing. The man on his knees appeared to be weeping softly. Mark said he didn't know what to do, and before he could do anything, one of the 2 men who had previously been arguing stepped away. Without a word, the man stepped behind the captive, lifted a pistol to the back of the man in white's head and pulled the trigger. Mark described seeing a splash of red, but said the weapon made a lot less noise than he thought it would. The man in white went limp and fell face first into the dirt. "Holy shit," I said, mouth falling agape as Mark concluded his story. I eyed him closely, but didn't see any aura of boasting in his eyes. They didn't twinkle like that of a man who tried telling a fabricated story to simply amaze or impress an audience. He didn't meet my gaze at all. As a matter of fact, he just clasped his hands in front of his mouth and stared into the campfire with a somber gaze. It was clear to me that what he was either an accomplished actor, or what he had witnessed truly haunted him. "Poor boy couldn't he been much older than you? I wish I would have done something, but I just ran." He shook his head, and his eyes seemed to glaze over. I just stay quiet, as there was nothing I could think to say. After a couple moments of lingering silence, Mark finally spoke again. "Zach, I gotta tell you a secret." He looked in the eye, and I gulped down the lump in my throat. "I don't particularly care for the government." I chuckled and Mark let out a small laugh. "I think you've mentioned that once or twice." I replied with a laugh. "Yeah, suppose I have, but it's not just because the IRS is after my ass. It's because of things like what I saw that day. It's because government corrupts by its very nature. It takes what it wants and destroys those who oppose it. Ain't no justice, no considerations, and nothing you can do about it." Now I don't know the details of what they were disagreeing on that night, but I guarantee you, that boy didn't deserve what he got. I nodded, but wasn't entirely convinced that he witnessed what he thought he had. "You sure it was government that did that?" "Could have been drug dealers or mafia." Mark hunched his shoulders and gave a snide chuckle. "What's the difference?" I chuckled, but didn't have a response. Well, I see why you'd think that, but that's because you ain't spent as much time out here as I have. But what you don't know, and what no one is supposed to know, is about the tunnels. I peeked an eyebrow at that comment. Tunnels? Mark grinned and nodded back. There are a series of tunnels that run deep below the earth. Gotta be a couple dozen of 'em within a few miles of us now. Government knows about 'em, maybe they built 'em, but, well, I doubt that. I think they're just interested by what's inside. And that is? I asked, now on the edge of my seat. Mark scoffed and shook his head. I have no idea, but it's gotta be something bad. I was a bit disappointed with that answer, but Mark immediately drew my curiosity back. You want to see one of 'em? I nodded without even really thinking. Mark grinned. I figured you might. It's a bit late in the day to go now, so what do you say we head out there first thing in the morning? I agreed without hesitance, and promised to return the next morning to meet up with Mark. I walked back down the trail that day with my imagination running wild. As I mentioned, I liked Mark and very much enjoyed our conversations. To me, he was somewhat like a compassionate grandfather with a plethora of exuberant stories that may or may not have been slightly exaggerated. I thought about all he had told me about the animal carcasses, the whistling thing, the voices, and the tunnels. I wanted to believe him, but urban legends abound in our day and age. I was well aware that perhaps he had just concocted these stories after his decades of isolation. I needed to see some proof for myself. Dew glistened on the leaves illuminated by the crimson sun rising over the hills as I set off the next morning. It was a bit chilly as I walked, but thoughts of the unknown kept me warm as I walked. Before long I arrived at Mark and I's usual meeting spot, and found him already waiting there for me. He greeted me, and without hesitation we began the trek out to his spot. We made small talk on the way, mostly about asinine topics like my family and work. After maybe 15 minutes of walking, we rounded a small bend tucked behind a small grove of trees. Mark stepped out in front and turned to face me. He then grinned and outstretched his hand to the right. I followed his gesture, and felt my jaw strike the floor. There was an opening in the side of the hill that was lined with smooth stone and bricks. It was quite enormous, with the perimeter having to have been at least 15 feet wide. The opening appeared collapsed and the entrance was filled with rubble and dirt, looking as though someone had intentionally yet clumsily sealed it. This is the tunnel? I asked. Mark nodded. One of many, but it wasn't sealed up like this last time I was here. How long ago was that? Mark shrugged. Dunno, maybe a year or two. I looked back at the collapsed tunnel. It was clear someone had gone through a great deal of effort to construct it, but the construction didn't look like a mining operation. I'm no expert in mining or anything, but I can't imagine they would spend time laying brick and creating such a wide entrance. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but the more curious fact was why it had been sealed up. I thought maybe it was just vandals, but that explanation somehow didn't satisfy. What's inside? I asked. Mark paused for a moment and stared towards the wreckage. He then shook his head and spat into the dirt. Bad things. I hoped he'd elaborate on that, but he didn't. I mean, it'd have to be for someone to seal it up like this, right? That's an impressive hole, would have taken a great deal of effort. He was right about that, but I still felt there was information he was withholding from me. You think this is the government's work? Mark nodded. Not a single doubt in my mind about it. Mark's head then suddenly flicked to the side and he stared out into the trees as if something had alerted him. I watched the color drain from his cheeks as his mouth pursed open. "We should go. I don't like lingering here for too long." I didn't argue, as clearly something had spooked him. He and I trekked back to his cabin, checking his snares on the way back. Mark found a pair of rabbits in his traps, and after swiftly snapping their necks he slung them over his shoulder. We got back to his cabin, and Mark set to work on harvesting the meat from the rabbits for his stew. I sat around, petting Daisy and Rally as they slobbered all over my knee and panted endlessly. "I don't think I ever told you about the scariest part of living out here, did I?" Mark asked. I looked up from the two dogs and stared at him, heart now beating with excitement. Mark sauntered over, carrying the meat of the rabbits along with a clump of chopped vegetables. He dumped the plate into the simmering cauldron on the fire, then took a seat across the fire. I stayed silent as he stared down at the flickering flames in deep thought. There are things out there that people don't know about. Creatures, places, and things that would seem to defy all explanation. The advancement of society and technology has led people to believe they're safe, and for the most part, they're right. So long as they stay out of the woods, those things can't get them, but there is something that can. Mark paused and looked me dead in the eye. I call it the silenced. He paused as if to allow the words to accumulate the dread he felt they deserved. I had an inkling of an idea where the conversation was headed, but just waited for him to explain. There's been rumors about it for a very long time, and it's something that has been affecting humanity for centuries, if not millennia. People have only just begun to realize it, but if they knew the true extent of what's going on, well, no one would ever go into the woods again. He paused and leaned in to stir the pot a bit, before sitting back. People disappear, Zach. No reason for it, no explanation, and no bodies are ever found. The cases seem to defy all explanation, and it happens again and again. Mark then suddenly grunted and began rubbing his eye. Damn smoke, sorry. Where was I?" "The disappearances," I replied. Mark seemed suddenly hesitant, as if he didn't know whether he should continue. "Yeah, the disappearances. I don't particularly like talking about this if I'm being honest. It's not really my business, but you're a good kid, Zach, and I know you come out here a lot, and I'd be devastated if anything were to happen to you." Dread crept around me like dozens of little spiders scurrying on my flesh. I couldn't help but raise my guard, and wonder where exactly this conversation was headed. Mark went on to tell me about this silence he mentioned. He said if ever I was walking through the woods and everything went completely silent, I was to drop to my knees and put my face in the dirt immediately. He said to stay that way until sounds returned to normal. "And what if the sound doesn't come back?" I asked, spine tingling with anxiety. Mark looked me dead in the eye, and his words offered nothing of comfort. "Then God help you." He said no more about the subject, and I didn't push him on it. It was clear he really wasn't comfortable discussing it beyond his initial warning. If he had any theories about what was responsible, he didn't voice them. The whole conversation had given me strong Missing 411 vibes, and I wondered whether he was referring to the same phenomenon. Both of us just sort of lingered in silence for a while as the stew finished cooking. A few minutes later, Mark leaned in and scooped 2 servings into bowls, handing one of them to me. The stew was delicious as usual, and I happily scarfed it down as Mark provided his hounds with their dinner as well, although didn't so much as nibble on his own serving. "What do you know about mimics?" I don't know why exactly I asked, but the thought had suddenly arisen in my mind. Mark seemed to perk up, but yet stared back with a look of confusion that seemed to contradict his reaction. "I'm sorry, what?" "Mimics," I clarified. "Some people call them imposters, or liars. Things that look and try to act human but aren't." Mark stared back at me, and a small grin slithered onto his face. "Now what would make you ask a question like that?" Mark's grin evaporated and he stared back with something akin to contempt. Truth is, some of the things I'd seen from him made me question who he claimed he was. There was just a subtle wrongness to him in a way I've never felt the words to accurately describe. "Just curious," I replied, staring back. Mark chuckled, but without any humor in his tone. "Your kind always is. Ever since your brothers took up arms against one another in the War of Gray and Blue, your curiosity has been quite insatiable. You think this land belongs to you, like this country is your own personal proving grounds to pillage and destroy as you please." His form seemed to shift as he spoke, his eyes shrinking in their sockets and his skin seemed to twitch. His teeth bared like the fangs of a cougar, and his long black hair flowing like a clump of wild eels. He leaned forward, in a gaze that no longer seemed entirely human. "Zach, there are things out here that your world of science and logic will never understand. And these things are better left alone." He and I just stared at one another, and I felt my heart beginning to thump away in my chest. I thought about his words, the War of Gray and Blue. Could he have been referring to the American Civil War? Why reference that event specifically? "What year did you say you moved out here?" I asked. Mark grinned again, now appearing more menacing than ever before. 96. 18. 96, I shook my head. "I don't understand," I replied, shaking my head. "Your kind never does." His voice had suddenly changed, becoming much more high-pitched like that of a young girl. His head cocked to the side, and his grin grew almost literally ear to ear as his mouth stretched impossibly wide. "Your kind has conquered this world. Both beast and nature bow at your might. You live in comfort, convinced that there is nothing that can hurt you anymore." His voice had changed again, sounding like a raspy, Scottish man with rolled R's. "But you are wrong." His voice had changed again, like that of a young, rebellious boy resisting his parents' wishes in a juvenile defiance. Mark then stood, and his form extended, making him tower over me and the campsite. Even Daisy and Raleigh started altering their form, like they were also simply hiding their true form. I rose and backed away, no longer seeing Mark as the friendly hermit I had known him to be. I thought that moment would be my end, and that the beast which hid itself in the form of Mark was prepared to devour me whole. Before he did, I had one final question I had to ask. "What are you?" Mark chuckled, his form continuing to grow abhorrently inhuman. He then shook his monstrous head. "Wrong question," his words bellowed forth, spoken in the chorus of 1,000 voices all in unison. I took another step back, wondering what he could have meant by that. It then struck me. "What do you want?" The thing I had once known as Mark stared down at me with an entirely inhuman gaze. To watch and protect, we stared at one another, and I attempted to understand what was happening. After all he had told me, and his time devoted to actually speaking with me, part of me almost wanted to believe his words were meant to reassure me. Like he was conveying that it was me, or more generally humanity as a whole, he wished to protect. After ruminating on it for a while though, I don't think that's the case anymore. Why are you telling me all this?" The thing I had once known as Mark grinned, as if that was the question he was waiting to hear. "So that you can tell the world." And so, I have. I left Mark and that trail behind, and I have not been back since. That's why I'm here now, to tell the world as the thing I once knew as Mark instructed me to. I don't even know why or what exactly I'm supposed to be telling. Maybe that Mark is not human and that there are things in the woods that will never be fully understood, or maybe that he is watching, and something has given him a great deal of power for some reason. I wish I had more answers, but I had to share this, regardless of whether anyone will believe it. And needless to say, I don't think I'll be visiting Mark again anytime soon. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/Taryn_Reed. Possible Wendigo encounter in Southern Ontario. I originally posted this on r/Skinwalkers, but figured I'd post it here too. Hi everyone. Had a very strange encounter in my woods today and thought I'd share and get some opinions. For some background, I live in a small town between Toronto and Ottawa on traditional Anishinaabe lands. I usually walk my dog every day, sometimes multiple times a day, all throughout my woods. I decided to take my dog out for a walk this afternoon and not put my headphones in. I usually do because, as I stated, I walk out there every day. As we were walking, I heard a voice call my name in almost a sing-song voice. Naturally, I stopped and looked around. I called for my dog to come to me, and he stopped where he was and stared at me for a while and then eventually came to me. I did not call out to the voice or acknowledge it. I walked around a little more and still didn't see anything. Just for some context, I live with my parents and my mom knows I am totally freaked out about skinwalkers. I had a bonfire a few nights ago and she hid and was calling out trying to freak me out. I figured since she knew I was by myself she was trying to freak me out, and it did sound similar to her voice. As I continued walking and looking, I heard, "Come over here." As soon as I heard it, I was instantly freaked out because not only did this sound further away than when my name was called, I know that the myth goes when they sound close they're far away and vice versa, but it also sounded like my own voice saying it. I also heard this call out much more clearly than when my name was called. Anyways, I didn't acknowledge the voice and, making sure my dog was with me, I got the hell out of there. When I got to the house, no one had been outside and no one had called for me. My family has lived on this property for generations, and we live outside of a very small town. I have no neighbors that would be close enough for me to hear them that clearly. I have no idea what was out there this afternoon, but I can tell you for certain I will never walk out there with my headphones on again. I also feel like it's worth mentioning that my sister has been whistling out there to freak me out, and I know that supposedly attracts them. I did also smoke shortly before walking, but I've been smoking daily for years and I've never suffered from auditory hallucinations or heard any sort of voices while high. I've never posted on here before, but if I have any other experiences I'll be sure to post them. Can honestly say that was the weirdest experience of my life. Sixth story. The moon hung low in the ink-black sky, casting an eerie glow over the dense, snow-covered forest. The air was frigid, and the only sound that pierced the silence was the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow. A lone figure trudged through the wilderness, wrapped in layers of heavy clothing, their breath forming frosty clouds in the freezing night air. This was Jake, a seasoned hunter who had heard tales of a malevolent creature that haunted these woods, a creature known as the Wendigo. As Jake moved deeper into the heart of the forest, the gnarled branches overhead seemed to reach out for him like skeletal fingers. The cold seeped through his clothes, and an unsettling feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. He shook off the discomfort, attributing it to the biting cold and the ominous stories he had heard. Legend had it that the Wendigo was once a man, consumed by an insatiable hunger that drove him to cannibalism. As he devoured the flesh of his fellow humans, a curse befell him, transforming him into a monstrous creature with an insatiable craving for human flesh. The creature was said to be cursed to roam the forest, perpetually hungry and eternally tormented. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an otherworldly chill that sent shivers down Jake's spine. He tightened the grip on his rifle, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the forest fell silent, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation. Jake's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but his pride and curiosity pushed him forward. A blood-curdling howl echoed through the woods, freezing Jake in his tracks. His heart raced, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the freezing temperatures. He listened intently, his senses heightened as the beastly wail reverberated through the night. The Wendigo was near. As Jake cautiously moved forward, the snow beneath his boots seemed to betray him with every creak and crackle. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, casting eerie shadows that danced on the forest floor. He stumbled upon a clearing, and there, bathed in the moonlight, stood the Wendigo. The creature was a grotesque amalgamation of human and beast. Its emaciated form was covered in matted fur, and its elongated limbs terminated in razor-sharp claws. Sunken eyes glowed with an otherworldly malevolence, and its mouth dripped with ichor. A guttural growl emanated from its throat as it locked eyes with Jake. Time stood still as the two adversaries faced each other. Jake's breaths came in ragged gasps, and the Wendigo circled him with a predatory grace. In the creature's eyes, Jake saw not just hunger but a profound and insatiable madness. With lightning speed, the Wendigo lunged at Jake, claws slashing through the air. The hunter barely managed to evade the attack, stumbling backward in the process. He raised his rifle, fingers trembling on the trigger. The Wendigo circled again, its movements unsettlingly swift and silent. A desperate shot echoed through the night, but the bullet merely grazed the creature's shoulder. The Wendigo roared in pain, its eyes burning with newfound fury. Jake knew he had only moments before the beast would strike again. He stumbled backward, trying to put distance between them, but the creature closed in with supernatural speed. Cornered and with nowhere to run, Jake faced the Wendigo head-on. The creature lunged, and the two collided in a violent struggle. Claws and teeth clashed as Jake fought for his life. The forest bore witness to a primal battle between man and monster, the struggle for survival etched in every movement. In the midst of the chaos, Jake's hands found a branch lying in the snow. With a desperate surge of strength, he plunged the makeshift weapon into the Wendigo's side. The creature howled in agony, momentarily distracted. Seizing the opportunity, Jake scrambled to his feet and sprinted through the twisted trees, the beast's enraged roars echoing behind him. As Jake ran, the forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows reaching out to claim him. He pushed himself to the brink of exhaustion, driven by fear and adrenaline. The haunting wails of the Wendigo faded into the distance, but Jake knew he couldn't escape the curse that now clung to him. Days turned into nights as Jake roamed the unforgiving wilderness, haunted by the memories of that fateful encounter. The line between man and monster blurred, and the hunger that had once consumed the Wendigo now gnawed at Jake's very soul. The forest, once a place of beauty, had become a nightmarish labyrinth, each shadow concealing a lurking terror. As the moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the desolate landscape, the legend of the Wendigo lived on. Whether man or monster, the curse endured, etching a tale of horror into the very fabric of the haunted forest. 7th story. This story was shared by you/the impertinent Thok 1. Wendigo encounter in Maine, perhaps multiple. Throughout my youth and through adulthood, I've had several encounters with entities and energies that are not of this realm, at least not as far as science and history is concerned. These past few years especially, I've had several terrifying experiences being stalked while taking walks late at night around Turner, Maine. Sometimes, I'm overcome with a sense of fear that's animalistic, and an innate sense of paranoia consumes me, as if something is watching from the woods and I need to get to safety fast. On other occasions, I've actually had something, quite aggressively, follow me, alongside me, from the treeline, chasing me away from certain areas, whispering in a low, human-like tone as it moves in the woods alongside me. It sounds like human footsteps crunching across tree branches, leaves, but so much larger, heavier than any human can step. This thing also can hurl itself from treetop to treetop, the power of it so great that it has actually knocked down trees, full goddamn trees, as it leaps. I could not fucking make this shit up. It is terrifying to be followed by something that's whispering as it walks in the trees beside you, even when you're running. Can seemingly teleport from one side of the road to the other in seconds. Is so big it can knock down trees as it jumps from top to top, and is so evasive, it can do all of these things while remaining hidden and not perceived by the naked eye. Besides those encounters, I've actually visually seen something I can only relate as a Wendigo. It was either comfortable enough with my energy to reveal itself, or something else altogether. Maybe it wanted to eat me, maybe it wanted to possess me, maybe it wanted to speak to me. I really don't know, because I didn't stick around long enough to find out. The energy of this thing, the way it looked, was so offensive, so terrifying. I only remained long enough to visualize what I instinctively knew was coming through the woods and was about to show itself to me. I was frozen while I waited for this thing to come out of the woods. Looking back, I don't know if it was curiosity or the power of the creature itself. I locked eyes with this thing, and when I did, I was suddenly watching myself from its perspective. As if I was now inside the creature. Horrified, I tore myself away. Luckily, I was on the front steps right next to the door, and ran inside with a lit cigarette. I was so scared. I wasn't even thinking any thought besides run. Now, I locked the door, hurried to my bedroom, and screamed for my housemate. I refused to even step out of my bedroom for the entire night, and I pulled down the blinds. This particular encounter was so terrifying I was shaking for hours and didn't sleep that night. Some definite details I can remember of this creature was that its face was sunken in, its head very large in size. Where its eyes should have been, were craters of black, and in the middle, golden, glowing orbs, very, very bright and flame-like. It was on all fours. But this thing can 100% easily walk if it wanted to, no problem. The creature was very, very thin. I remember that detail very clear. Its chest was near skeletal, and its stomach caved in as if it hadn't eaten in 100 years. Its arms and legs both were very, very, very long. Both arms and legs were insanely muscled and massive. Honestly, its arms and legs were the only part of the creature's anatomy that had any mass about it. The creature itself was big. I'm talking 10 foot tall easy. And if I had to guess, it weighed anywhere between 500 to 600 pounds. It seemingly had fur covering some parts of its body, along the tops of its arms, back and thighs, but the fur was scarce. Initially, I thought werewolf, but after looking up different cryptids, I can safely say I don't think it was that. Another detail I remember was its mouth. This thing was smiling at me. Its teeth were razor sharp, almost needle-like and long. The size of its smile and the teeth took up most of its face. Where a nose should have been, there were just nostrils, almost like a skull. Its face, actually, was very skull-like. The whole body very skeletal. Anyway, I just would really like to talk to somebody who has had similar experiences, or somebody who can relate. This thing, by the way, was not the only cryptid I've encountered or been chased by. The Androscoggin and all around Androscoggin County is very terrifying, old, haunted and linked to some type of portal or some shit. Ley line perhaps? All of this is just dust in the wind, and only things I know as fact are from what I personally have witnessed and heard. So many times at night, while walking along the river, I've heard screams so terrifying, so otherworldly, I can only relate it to the cry of a banshee. In the woods around Lake Auburn and also around Mt. Appetite, heading toward Mechanic Falls and then, in the other direction, toward Sabatis and Turner. This area has insanely negative, abrasive, offending energy, and if you're going to walk at night, try to be aware. And yes, I know how all of this sounds. Rest assured, I'm not delusional or any sense of crazy. I'm just looking to hear other stories of a similar nature. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comment section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.